But we also recognize that the Minnesota governor and the Minneapolis mayor need to take a long, hard look in the mirror. They need to evaluate their rhetoric, their conversations, and their encouragement of such violence against our citizens and our law enforcement officers. I'll remind you that Governor Walz today in his press conference said that our officers were not even law enforcement, which is a lie. He's called them the Gestapo.
Tonight we are looking at a press briefing conducted at the FEMA headquarters. The subject was supposed to be a winter storm. It became a platform for a federal indictment of a state governor. We are going to look at the words used by the Department of Homeland Security leadership. We are going to look at the specific accusations leveled against Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Frey. We are going to examine the evidence presented for those accusations. And we are going to look at the refusal to answer basic questions about a fatal shooting.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. There are two different things that I'd like to discuss with you tonight. The first one being a storm that is barreling down on our country and will be impacting approximately 250 million Americans in 40 different states. We've been working together here at the FEMA headquarters and have opened our National Response Coordination Center and are working with local and state authorities to make sure that we're getting individuals and communities pre-deployed resources that they may need and also preparing them for the upcoming days, which will significantly impact them and their citizens.
A cabinet official stood at a federal podium and claimed that a sitting governor and mayor want violence and are intentionally facilitating murder to cover up financial crimes. That is a lie. It is a fabrication of intent designed to justify federal intervention in a sovereign state. When the Department of Homeland Security claims that Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Frey have chosen the side of lawbreakers, criminals, murderers, and rapists over their own citizens, that is not a statement of public policy. That is a prosecutorial opening statement delivered without a grand jury. It is a lie about the sworn duties of elected officials.
In Minneapolis, Governor Walz and Mayor Frey, they instead choose violence. They instead choose to encourage the destruction of their city and the crime against their people. It appears that they want this lawlessness to continue. It appears that they want chaos to distract from the theft and the fraud and the corruption of their city. I'll remind you that this city has been corrupt for years with what we've seen with people that have been stealing taxpayer money, all under the leadership of Governor Walz and Mayor Frey.
We must look at the specific words spoken by the official at the podium. The official is Kristi Noem. She is speaking from the FEMA headquarters. She is ostensibly there to discuss a storm impacting 250 million Americans, but she quickly pivots to a political attack. Here is the lie regarding the intent of Minnesota officials. Kristi Noem states, "It appears that they want this lawlessness to continue. It appears that they want chaos to distract from the theft and the fraud and the corruption of their city." She goes further. She attributes specific malicious motives to Governor Tim Walz. She says, "He's called them the Gestapo. He's refused to turn over murders to federal law enforcement officers. He's protected illegal criminals and even overseen a historic, unprecedented theft of American taxpayer dollars."
At 9:05 a.m. Central Time, the Department of Homeland Security law enforcement officials and officers were conducting targeted operations in Minneapolis against an illegal alien whose criminal history included domestic assault with intentionally inflicting bodily harm, disorderly conduct, and driving without a valid license. An individual approached U.S. Border Patrol officers with a 9mm semi-automatic handgun. The officers attempted to disarm this individual, but the armed suspect reacted violently.
She claims that Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Frey choose violence and choose to encourage the destruction of their city. This is the claim. The claim is that Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Frey are not merely disagreeing with federal policy. The claim is that they are active co-conspirators in violence and theft. Let us examine the evidence presented in this briefing to support these claims. We must look at what the sources prove and what they do not prove. The briefing begins with a report on a storm. Kristi Noem notes that the storm will impact 250 million Americans in 40 states. She lists the states receiving emergency declarations signed by President Donald Trump. Then the subject changes to a shooting in Minneapolis. The facts provided by the source are these. At 9:05 a.m., DHS officers were conducting an operation in Minneapolis. An individual approached. Shots were fired. The individual is dead. Kristi Noem claims the deceased individual had a criminal history, including domestic assault. She claims the individual had a 9mm semi-automatic handgun and 2 magazines. Now we look for the evidence supporting the claim that Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Frey facilitated this specific event or want this violence. The source text shows that when reporters ask for evidence, the evidence is not provided. A reporter asks, "Where's the evidence of his ideology, though?" Kristi Noem does not provide evidence of the deceased man's ideology. Instead, she pivots to an attack on the governor. She answers, "We have asked these state officials to help partner with us. They have refused over and over and over again." The reporter asks specifically about the sequence of events. Video appears to show he's disarmed before shots are fired, so I just want clarity on that. Kristi Noem does not answer the question about the video. She does not offer evidence to refute the video. She says, "We're continuing to follow the exact same protocols that we always have, and so this investigation is ongoing." When asked why federal agents told the Minneapolis Police Department to leave the scene, Kristi Noem does not deny it. She does not explain the legal basis for removing local police. She says, "I want dude to not distract away from the facts of this situation. Our law enforcement officers were there doing a targeted operation."
Video appears to show he's disarmed before shots are fired. So I just want clarity on that. And beyond that, I just want to follow up and ask who within the federal government is leading the criminal investigation, understanding that CBP OPR has opened up an internal investigation. And beyond that, why did federal agents tell Minneapolis Police Department to leave the scene?
We're continuing to follow the exact same protocols that we always have. And so this investigation is ongoing. We're continuing to.
The evidence in the source shows that Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Frey are engaged in a jurisdictional dispute. The evidence shows they have refused to cooperate with certain federal requests. There is no evidence in the source that Governor Tim Walz or Mayor Frey want violence. There is no evidence in the source that they are stealing billions of dollars. Kristi Noem asserts the theft is historic and unprecedented, but she provides no indictment, no case number, and no specific instance of this theft in the briefing. The evidence proves that a shooting occurred. The evidence proves that President Donald Trump and his administration are in conflict with Governor Tim Walz. The evidence does not prove the motive of the governor. The evidence does not prove the motive of the mayor. We must analyze the power dynamics at play in this briefing. This is not a standard press conference. This is a display of federal force against local control. Consider the setting. Kristi Noem is standing at the FEMA headquarters. This is the nerve center for national disaster response. By combining the storm briefing with the attack on Governor Tim Walz, the administration is leveraging the authority of emergency management to legitimize a political attack. The storm is described as barreling down on our country. President Donald Trump has approved emergency declarations for states like South Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia. By listing these states and the federal support they receive, Kristi Noem establishes the power of the federal purse. Then she contrasts this with Minnesota. She threatens the legitimacy of Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Frey. She uses the term Democrat mayor when referring to Memphis to show that cooperation is possible if you submit to federal authority. She mentions that in Texas and Florida, we don't have this problem, because those officials submit to federal operations. The power dynamic is explicit. If you are a governor who cooperates with President Donald Trump, you are a partner. If you are Governor Tim Walz, you are accused of facilitating murder. Kristi Noem explicitly attacks the legitimacy of Governor Tim Walz's authority. She says, "Who would trust Governor Walz at this point?" She attempts to strip him of his moral authority to govern. She uses the power of the federal podium to redefine the deceased individual. She labels him a domestic terrorist. When challenged on the definition, she expands the definition of terrorism to include resisting law enforcement. She states, "When you perpetuate violence against a government because of ideological reasons, that is the definition of domestic terrorism." This is a seizure of linguistic control. By labeling a street confrontation as domestic terrorism, the federal government invokes a different set of powers. It moves the incident from a local police matter to a national security threat. This justifies the exclusion of local police. It justifies the presence of federal agents. It justifies the rhetoric used by President Donald Trump. The control mechanism is the quote-unquote protocol. When pressed on why witnesses were detained or why local police were blocked, Kristi Noem repeats, "We're continuing to follow the exact same protocols that we always have." The protocol is the shield. It allows the federal agency to operate without transparency while demanding total submission from Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Frey. The strongest defense argument for the actions of the Department of Homeland Security is the safety of their officers and the enforcement of immigration law. Kristi Noem argues that the operation was, quote, targeted against a dangerous criminal. She argues that the individual had a, quote, criminal history included domestic assault. She argues that the officers, quote, fired defensive shots because they feared for their lives. The defense argument is that Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Frey are endangering the public by refusing to cooperate with these lawful operations. Kristi Noem states, all we want them to do is that when they are going to release a dangerous criminal from their jails, turn them over to us. This is the law and order defense. It relies on the premise that federal jurisdiction is absolute and that local non-cooperation is inherently dangerous. Now, we dismantle this argument using the law and the sources provided. The source reveals that the safety argument is contradicted by the operational conduct described. A reporter notes that federal agents blocked his agency from the shooting scene even after they obtained a judicial warrant. If the operation was lawful and the shooting was justified, the standard legal procedure is an independent investigation. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension attempted to conduct this investigation. They secured a judicial warrant. A warrant is a legal order issued by a judge. It carries the weight of the law. Kristi Noem admits that federal agents blocked the state agents. She does not cite a legal exemption that allows federal agents to ignore a state judicial warrant for a homicide investigation. Instead, she pivots to the political dispute. She says, we have asked these state officials to help partner with us. They have refused. Refusal to partner on immigration policy is not legal grounds to obstruct a homicide investigation. The defense collapses under the weight of the jurisdictional overreach. Furthermore, the defense claims the individual was a domestic terrorist. A reporter asks, where's the evidence of his ideology, though? Kristi Noem provides none. She redefines the term. She says, he was asked to show up and to continue to resist by a governor who's irresponsible. This dismantles the defense that this was an independent act of terrorism. She is arguing that the governor of Minnesota inspired the suspect. She is linking the suspect's actions directly to the speech of Governor Tim Walz. This shifts the argument from law enforcement to political retribution. The defense argues they are keeping people safe. Yet, the source notes that 5 people have also died in immigration detention so far this year. When asked about this, Kristi Noem claims the narrative is absolutely false and that standards are at the highest level. She offers no specific rebuttal to the death count. She dismisses the factual premise of the question. The defense argument is that Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Frey are the source of the danger. But the source shows that the violence occurred during a federal operation where local authorities were excluded. The responsibility for the scene management lay with the federal agency. The exclusion of the local police, led by Mayor Frey and Governor Tim Walz, means the federal agency holds sole accountability for the immediate outcome. We need to understand the legal concepts being distorted here. We need to understand jurisdiction, obstruction, and domestic terrorism. Jurisdiction is the authority to act. In the United States, police powers are primarily reserved to the states. The Minneapolis Police Department answers to Mayor Frey. The Minnesota State Police answer to Governor Tim Walz. They have jurisdiction over crimes committed on their streets, including homicide. Federal agents have jurisdiction over federal crimes like immigration violations. When a federal agent shoots someone in Minneapolis, 2 things happen. There is an internal federal review, and there is a local criminal investigation because a body is on a Minneapolis street. Usually, these 2 jurisdictions cooperate, but in this case, the source indicates that federal agents blocked the state agents who had a warrant. A judicial warrant is a court order. Ignoring a warrant can be considered obstruction of justice. Next, domestic terrorism. Under the Patriot Act and subsequent federal law, domestic terrorism requires acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of criminal laws and, this is the key part, appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. It requires a specific intent. It requires an ideology. Kristi Noem defines it in the briefing as, when you perpetuate violence against a government because of ideological reasons, that is the definition of domestic terrorism. However, she attributes the ideology to the governor. She implies the suspect was acting on behalf of Governor Tim Walz's rhetoric. This is a legal stretch that attempts to make the governor responsible for the criminal acts of a third party. Finally, the Insurrection Act. A reporter asks if this moves President Donald Trump closer to invoking the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act is a law that allows the president to deploy the military within the United States to suppress rebellion. It is the nuclear option of federal power. It overrides the governor. Kristi Noem's answer is significant. She does not say no. She says, the president will use every tool that he needs to. This is a signal that the administration believes it has the legal authority to bypass Governor Tim Walz entirely. We must render a professional judgment on the fitness of this official and this administration based on this performance. Kristi Noem is the Secretary of Homeland Security. Her primary duty is the safety of the homeland. This includes disaster response. In this briefing, she spends significant time attacking Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Frey while a storm is barreling down on our country. She explicitly conflates the storm response with the political battle. She says, "We're here and have been opened and visiting and talking with all of the governors and local leaders." But she then singles out Governor Tim Walz as untrustworthy. It is professionally irresponsible to use a FEMA briefing to undermine the public trust in a governor during a declared emergency. Governor Tim Walz is the person who must manage the storm response in Minnesota. By attacking his legitimacy, Kristi Noem is endangering the coordination necessary to save lives in that state. She engages in name-calling. She says Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Frey choose the side of lawbreakers, criminals, murderers, and rapists. This is not the language of a professional law enforcement administrator. This is the language of a partisan operative. She accuses them of historic, unprecedented theft and fraud and theft. These are specific criminal allegations. A responsible official would file charges. A responsible official would present evidence. Kristi Noem presents neither. She uses the podium to convict them in the court of public opinion without due process. She also attacks the press. When a reporter asks about the death of 5 people in detention, she calls the narrative absolutely false. She does not address the specific deaths. She attacks the question. This demonstrates a lack of fitness for the high office she holds. The role requires neutrality, precision, and adherence to the law. Kristi Noem displays bias, vagueness, and a disregard for the jurisdictional rights of the states. So the consequences are clear. The federal government will continue to operate unilaterally in American cities. Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Frey will face legal pressure from federal grand juries. The definition of domestic terrorism will be expanded to include resistance to federal operations. And the truth of what happened at 9:05 a.m. in Minneapolis will remain buried under a mountain of political accusations. That is the evidence. That is the law. And that is the lack of accountability we are witnessing tonight. Let's go back to the storm. 250 million Americans. That is the number Kristi Noem cited. These Americans are facing dangerous freezing rain and ice and life-threatening wind chills. They need a functional FEMA. They need a functional relationship between their governors and the White House. They do not have it. They have a FEMA headquarters that has been turned into a staging ground for political warfare. They have a Secretary of Homeland Security who is more focused on the, quote, corruption of Governor Tim Walz than on the coordination of snowplows in Minnesota. Kristi Noem says, "We want everybody to recognize the seriousness of it." She is talking about the storm. But we should recognize the seriousness of what she did at that podium. She declared war on a state government. She declared that the elected leaders of Minnesota are partners with rapists and murderers. She declared that the federal government acts alone. And she did it all while standing under the seal of the Department of Homeland Security. That is the reality. Governor Tim Walz has been subpoenaed. Mayor Frey has been subpoenaed. The Attorney General has been subpoenaed. The investigation is blocked. The storm is coming. And the federal government is at war with the states. This is the situation. President Donald Trump has authorized this approach. Kristi Noem is executing this approach. Governor Tim Walz is the target of this approach. Mayor Frey is collateral damage in this approach. And the American people, waiting for the storm, are watching their government tear itself apart. That's all Kristi Noem says about her request to the governor. That's all. But as we have seen, it is not all. It is everything. It is the total consolidation of power. It is the total rejection of local oversight. It is the Lawrence O'Donnell rule. Claim, evidence, law, accountability. The claim is false. The evidence is missing. The law is twisted, and the accountability is zero. Governor Tim Walz, Mayor Frey, President Donald Trump, Kristi Noem. These are the names. These are the players. And this is the breakdown of the American system. We will continue to follow the quote-unquote protocols. We will continue to watch the subpoenas, and we will continue to ask the questions that Kristi Noem refused to answer, because that is our job, even when the government calls it a, quote, distraction. It is not a distraction. It is the news, and that is why we are here.